I've been a detective for nearly 15 years, but nothing prepared me for the case that landed on my desk last September. It started with a voice on the radio, a voice that millions of people had trusted for decades. John Harris, the voice of the morning drive for over 40 years, had announced his retirement months earlier. His last show was supposed to be a celebration, a farewell to a career that had become a cornerstone of our community. But instead of heartfelt calls and nostalgic anecdotes, Harris gave us something else entirely, a confession. I wasn't listening live, but the recording was impossible to miss. It started innocently enough, Harris reminiscing about his first day on the air, the pranks he pulled on his producers, the time he accidentally let an F-bomb slip during a traffic update. Then his tone shifted. The jovial, easygoing cadence that had made him so beloved took on a darker, sharper edge. "I've been holding on to something for a long time," he said. 40 years is a long time to live with a secret, and since this is my last day, I figure it's time to let it out. Back in the 80s, there was someone I knew. Someone I hurt. I didn't mean for things to go the way they did, but There was a long pause. Dead air, as they call it in the business. When he finally spoke again, his voice was shaking. "I killed someone," he said. "I'll admit, my first reaction wasn't shock or horror. It was disbelief. Plenty of people had already dismissed the confession as a publicity stunt, a calculated way to make his last broadcast unforgettable. But then, as the broadcast continued, he gave us a few chilling details. A description of the victim. A location, an abandoned service station just outside town. And finally, a date, August 12, 1986. By the time I got to the station, a team was already working to corroborate his story. The location he mentioned matched the scene of an unsolved murder from that summer. The victim, a young woman named Sarah Mills, had been found in the station's back office. Her case had gone cold decades ago. The department's cold case unit pulled Sarah's file for me that afternoon. The details were as grim as I'd expected: blunt force trauma to the head, no witnesses, no significant forensic evidence. At the time, investigators had theorized that she'd been attacked during a robbery gone wrong, but no suspects were ever identified. If Harris's confession was true, he had just reopened a wound that had barely begun to scar. Of course, not everyone believed him. The DA was skeptical, and Harris's lawyer wasted no time issuing a statement that his client's words had been taken out of context. But something about the broadcast, the tremor in his voice, the specific details he offered, made me think there was more to this story than an aging shock jock's attempt to stay relevant. It wasn't long before the story took an even stranger turn. While reviewing old case files, one of our analysts noticed a disturbing pattern. 3 other murders, all from the same era, bore striking similarities to Sarah's. The victims were all young women, all attacked in isolated locations, all killed in the same brutal fashion. And, just like Sarah, all their cases had gone cold. The possibility of a serial killer operating in our sleepy town was enough to make my stomach churn. If Harris's confession was genuine, he might not just be responsible for Sarah Mills's death. He could be tied to 3 more murders we'd never connected before. I needed to talk to him. Officially, Harris wasn't under arrest, yet. He'd agreed to come in for questioning, but I could tell he wasn't taking it seriously. He strolled into the interview room wearing a polo shirt and khakis, his silver hair neatly combed, his face split into a practiced smile. "Detective Thorne, is it?" he said, extending a hand. "Big fan of the show." "Don't worry, I get that a lot." I ignored his hand and gestured to the chair across from mine. "Have a seat, Mr. Harris." He sat, still smiling, as if we were about to discuss the weather instead of a potential murder confession. I slid a copy of the transcript across the table. "You want to tell me about this?" I asked. His smile faltered, just for a second. Then he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. That. Look, detective, it's called entertainment. You'd be amazed at the things people believe if you say them with enough conviction. So you're saying you made it up?" "Of course I made it up." "Then why do your details match the scene of a real murder?" For the first time, he looked genuinely surprised. "They do." I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "Sarah Mills. August 12, 1986. Does that ring a bell?" His smile was gone now. He stared at me, unblinking, as if trying to gauge how much I knew. When he finally spoke, His voice was barely above a whisper. "I need a lawyer." That's when I knew we had him, or at least part of him. The problem was, Harris's confession was just the beginning. If he really had killed Sarah Mills, why had he waited so long to admit it? And, more importantly, what did he know about the other 3 victims? Those questions kept me awake that night, turning over every angle, every possibility. The answers, I knew, would be buried in the past, in the details we'd missed or dismissed all those years ago. If Harris thought he could hide behind the passage of time, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The next morning, I stood outside the abandoned service station. The building was crumbling, its windows shattered, and graffiti lined the brick walls like scars. It hadn't changed much since the 80s, but the weight of what happened here made the air feel heavier. I'd asked the forensics team to re-examine the site, even though it felt like a long shot. Decades of decay didn't leave much room for new evidence. "Detective Thorne." A voice pulled me from my thoughts. It was Officer Diaz, one of the newer recruits. She jogged over, holding a manila folder. "Thought you'd want to see this." I opened the folder and scanned the papers inside. It was Harris's personnel file from the radio station. Buried among his glowing performance reviews and awards was a single reprimand from August 1986. The station had received complaints about Harris acting erratically on air that month. Slurred words, sudden silences. He'd been sent home for 2 weeks to rest. The timing was too convenient to ignore. "Good work," I said, handing the folder back. "Let's dig deeper. I want to know who Harris was talking to back then. Guests, callers, anyone who might have heard something." Diaz nodded, but her face remained tense. "There's something else," she said hesitantly. "The 3 other victims?" I found a connection. She pulled out another sheet of paper. All 3 women had ties to the station. One was a former intern, another worked in promotions, and the last was a frequent guest on one of the shows. My stomach sank. Harris hadn't just stumbled into this. He'd known these women. This wasn't random. "Good work," I said again, though the words felt hollow. If Diaz was right, we were dealing with a predator who had used his position to hunt his victims, and he might have done it under everyone's noses. Back at the station, Harris's lawyer had arrived, and we were ready for round 2. The man sitting across from me was different now, stiffer, quieter, the practiced charm gone. His lawyer, a slick, sharp-eyed man named Jonathan Krell, did most of the talking. "My client has already explained that his confession was fabricated," Krell said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Unless you have concrete evidence, this interview is over." I ignored him and turned to Harris. "You worked with Sarah Mills, didn't you?" Harris hesitated, then nodded. "She was a receptionist." "Sweet kid." "And the other women?" "Jennifer Price, Linda Carr, and Amy Watts?" "You knew them too." Harris's eyes flicked to Krell, who leaned in to whisper something. But before he could speak, Harris cut him off. "I knew them," he said quietly. "They all worked at the station at some point." "Did you kill them?" The room went silent. Harris stared at me, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then he laughed, not a full laugh, but a short, bitter sound. "You think I'm some kind of monster," he said. "You think I spent decades smiling on the air while doing that?" I didn't answer. Instead, I slid a photo across the table, a crime scene photo of Sarah Mills. Harris's face paled as he looked at it. "Is this a joke to you, Mr. Harris?" I asked. "Because it's not a joke to her family." His voice cracked. "I didn't kill her. But you know who did, don't you?" Krell slammed his hand on the table. "This interview is over." Harris stood abruptly, but I wasn't done. "You went to the service station that night. You know something. And if you think we're going to stop digging, you're dead wrong." Harris froze, his back to me. For a moment, I thought he might say something. But then Krell grabbed his arm and led him out of the room. Later that night, I sat in my office, staring at the board I'd put together. Photos of the victims, maps, timelines, all of it felt like pieces to a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Harris was hiding something, but was he the killer? Or was he protecting someone else? Then my phone buzzed. It was Diaz. "Detective, you're going to want to see this," she said. We pulled old recordings from the radio station archives, and, There's something you need to hear." 10 minutes later, I was in the audio lab, listening to a recording from August 11th, 1986, the day before Sarah Mills was killed. It was Harris's show, but he wasn't alone. Another voice, a man's voice, was on the recording, low and taunting. "Careful, John," the man said. "Secrets have a way of catching up with you." The blood drained from my face. "Who is that?" I asked. Diaz shook her head. "We're still trying to figure it out. But there's more." She played another clip, this one from 2 weeks later. "Same show, same voice. I told you I'd clean it up," the man said. "But you're still shaking, John." "Why?" The pieces were starting to fall into place. Harris wasn't the killer. He was the scapegoat, or maybe the accomplice. And the real killer? He'd been taunting Harris for decades, hiding in plain sight. I didn't know who he was yet, but I knew one thing for sure: the game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, I called Harris back into the station. His lawyer protested, but Harris agreed to come, his face pale and drawn. He must have realized I was closing in. I brought him into the interview room, this time without Krell. "This ends today, John," I said, my voice firm. "I've listened to the tapes. I know someone else was involved." "Who is he?" Harris slumped in the chair, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. For a moment, I thought he'd clam up, but then he spoke, softly, as if the words were too heavy to say aloud. "His name's Charlie. Charlie Bennett. We worked together back in the day, before things got out of hand." "Go on," I urged. Harris exhaled shakily. "Charlie was a producer at the station, but he had a temper. He and Sarah, she caught his eye, you know? He got obsessive, possessive. The night she died, I went to the service station to confront him. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." "What happened, John?" "I got there too late." His voice broke. She was already gone. Charlie was standing over her, blood on his hands. He begged me to help him clean it up, said no one would believe it was an accident. I didn't know what to do, so I helped him. I helped him hide the evidence. And after that night, he made sure I never forgot it. "Made sure how?" "He called me, sent letters, showed up at the station sometimes, just to remind me. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd make it look like I was the one who did it. The confession was damning, but it wasn't enough. I needed Charlie Bennett. Tracking Charlie down wasn't easy. He'd disappeared from public records years ago, but eventually Diaz found a lead, a property under his mother's maiden name on the outskirts of town. A cabin in the woods, secluded and unassuming. We assembled a team and moved in cautiously. When we arrived, the place was eerily quiet. The cabin's windows were boarded up, and the front yard was littered with rusted tools and debris. Inside, we found walls lined with photographs, snapshots of Sarah Mills, Jennifer Price, Linda Carr, and Amy Watts. It was a shrine, a twisted memorial to his crimes. In the back room, we found Charlie himself, hunched over a desk. He didn't resist. In fact, he almost seemed relieved as we cuffed him and read him his rights. His eyes were hollow, his frame gaunt, as if the weight of his secrets had consumed him. Back at the station, I sat across from him in the interrogation room. Unlike Harris, Charlie didn't try to charm or deflect. He confessed to everything: the murders, the obsession, and the way he'd used Harris as his pawn. "I never thought he'd last this long," Charlie said, his voice flat. "He was always so scared, so easy to control. I thought he'd crack years ago." "He did," I said. "And that's why you're here." Charlie smirked, but there was no triumph in it, only resignation. "Guess I finally ran out of luck." The trial was a media circus. Harris testified against Charlie, striking a deal that kept him out of prison but destroyed his reputation. Charlie was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Justice, after decades of silence, had finally been served. But for me, the case didn't feel like a victory. The lives lost couldn't be brought back, and the scars left on the victims' families, and even Harris, would never fully heal. I stood outside the courthouse after the verdict, watching the reporters swarm the steps, and felt the familiar emptiness that always followed a case like this. "Thorne," Diaz said, walking up beside me. "You okay?" I nodded. "Yeah. Just thinking." About what? How some people can live with this kind of darkness for so long. I looked at her. And how we never saw it. She didn't respond right away. Then she said, "We saw it this time." I nodded again, letting her words sink in. She was right. We'd seen it, and we'd stopped it. That had to count for something. As I walked back to my car, I glanced at the radio dial. The station Harris once dominated had been silent for weeks, the fallout from the scandal too much to bear. But a new voice would rise eventually. It always did. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that the next voice might bring something brighter.